Okay, so we should be recording now. Oh, sorry. So welcome to Leading Lasting Learning. This is our monthly GRC Alliance meeting from the Business Agility Institute. I'm your facilitator, Jeremy Pullen, and I'm a consultant in Atlanta doing DevOps, DevSecOps, and Kanban primarily, and really excited to be here with you guys. And we've got Karl Scotland presenting, and I'll talk a little bit more about Karl in a second. So for those of you who are new, the GRC Alliance is a subgroup of the Business Agility Institute, and the website businessagility.institute, and we have a Slack channel, a Slack community, businessagilityforum.slack.com. We participate in the governance track, and all of our information gets posted there. I also send out monthly meetings for us to have both informal community discussions as well as webinars like this. And we typically communicate that by calendar invites and then follow up with social media posts and other things. So if any of you aren't participating, it's free. Just either email me. My email address will be at the end, or participate via the Slack channel, and love to have you participate. Okay, and what is Agile GRC? So GRC is an acronym referring to governance, risk management, and compliance. Karl and I were just talking before the call started that governance and ultimately ends up being one of the major constraining factors for Agile behaviors, culture, and adoption. And it's critical then that we have a governance-centric view of what Agile really means and what agility means within governance. And so it really begins with a focus on the survivability of the institution on its own terms and the ability to achieve its long and short-term objectives in a volatile world. If we don't have alignment on that, and if Agile isn't supporting that, then we're doing something wrong. So that's really what we're trying to achieve here. And so, as I said, let's connect. If you haven't connected with us yet, join the Slack channel or email me, either message me on Twitter or email me at jeremy@pelotus.com. Okay, our upcoming schedule is the first Thursday of every month. September 6th, we'll have Manoj Khanna talking about Agile governance and shifting paradigms. I will tentatively be talking about ITIL and SOX compliance in Agile, and we're requesting submissions for our November 1st and subsequent meetings. Love to have community members submit topics to discuss. Okay, any questions before I introduce Karl? All right, well, just some rules of the road here. Please manage your mute button. And as I said, we're recording this. We'll be posting the recording to YouTube after the talk. So let me introduce Karl. Karl is a consultant helping businesses become learning organizations. He's done a lot of work with a lot of companies you can see here, including Rally, Cisco, and others, and has recently gotten really involved in the topic of strategy deployment. And so really excited to have you with us, Karl. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to you, and the rest of the session is yours until the Q&A at the end.
Great, thanks very much. Let me share my desktop. That's good timing. Hopefully, my wife will answer that in a second. Good. Sorry about that. Yeah. So hi everybody. Glad to be with you. As Jeremy said, so I'm Karl Scotland. I'm based in the UK, so I live down in Brighton on the south coast of England. I'm an independent consultant, and I've been spending a lot of my time recently looking at strategy deployment, and how do we use some of those ideas within agile transformations. So we're going to start off with some polls. So when I flick to the next slide, it's going to activate a poll. You can complete that poll, so it's not in Zoom. It's on a website called Poll Everywhere. So if you go to this URL, pollev.com/bizagility, you should get a placeholder screen, and then eventually, as I work through a number of polls, those will activate. You can do that on your phone or on your browser. So let's move that forward. Let's see. First one usually takes a little bit of time to come up. So it's going to ask you a question. It's going to be a multiple choice set of answers. So go to pollev.com/bizagility. And the question is, in your experience, are people given detailed instructions or simple intent or something in between? So think of this as a scale. So the one on the scale is people of your experience, people are given very detailed instructions on how to work. And the other end of the scale, people are given no instructions at all, and maybe some very simple intent, and there's a range in between. So I'm just going to wait to give you a chance to get onto that URL and fill in some results. And once the total results that's down at the bottom of the corner looks like it's at a reasonably settled number, I can show what the final results are. All right, so that seems to have stopped at 3. So let's look at that. So a pretty broad mix there. So and more down towards the detailed instructions end than the simple intent end. So the next poll. So staying on the same URL, you should see the poll update. The next one again. In your experience, do people focus more on a range of from being indispensable through to becoming redundant? So if they're being indispensable, they know everything, they're the only person that can do things, you really can't do without them, or do people focus on making themselves redundant? So actually they're not needed because other people have the skills and the knowledge that, that is needed. And again, a scale in between 1 and 6. So let's have a look at that. Taking a bit of time to come up. There we go. Okay, so another result here, but yeah, so generally, half of you focusing on being indispensable, somebody that's slightly more the end scale, but slightly in the middle. And then the third poll then, so in your experience, well, how are people rewarded? So are people rewarded for avoiding errors, not making any mistakes at all, getting things right first time? Or at the other end of the scale, are people rewarded for taking risks? Okay, so let's look at the results for that one. So yeah, right down to fifth half of you are avoiding risks, and the others down that end, sorry, avoiding errors, not taking risks. So that's those kind of prompts are kind of broadly covering some of the topics I want to cover today, around how can we make sure people have more intent so we don't need to give them detailed instructions. How can we allow people to develop so we're not relying on individuals, but people are more redundant, not making people redundant by losing people's jobs, but we're not so dependent on key individuals. and how can we encourage people to start taking more risks and worrying less on avoiding errors. So this is what I call leading lasting learning. So the clarifying intent, and we'll look at an approach called the X matrix, developing understanding and developing our people, and we'll talk about an approach called catchball, and the learning side of it, befriending failure. So how can we take a more experimental view to the way we work? I got onto this topic, and the things I'm going to talk about in this session, really a lot of them kind of come from the strategy work. And my favorite book on strategy is this book by Richard Rumelt called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, where he talks about a good strategy having these three elements: a strategy kernel having diagnosis, guiding policies, and coherent action. So we need to understand what problem we're trying to solve. That's the diagnosis piece. Then we need to have some guiding policy, so guiding people in making decisions. And then we need to have some form of action, so some decision on what sort of action we're going to take. So diagnosis, understanding diagnosis is a little bit to do with defining intent. Our intent is to solve the problems we discover in diagnosis. We want to use guiding policies to help people understand the sort of approaches we'd like people to take without telling them what to do. And then we want people to understand what coherent action people are taking and to learn from that action. So I use this a lot, and I'll probably refer back to some of these ideas throughout the session. So we'll start off with leading. So how do we clarify intent, and what is the X matrix? So let's begin with Stephen Bungay's work. So Stephen Bungay wrote a book called The Art of Action, where he looked at military history, and he shows us in his book Art of Action how the military solved a lot of the business problems we're having now over 100 years ago. So he goes back to the work of Field Marshal Helmut von Moltke, who was Chief of Staff of the Prussian Army in the late 19th century, so a long time ago. And around that time, there's this view, which I think is still a fairly common view in a lot of people, that alignment and autonomy are two ends of a single scale. So you can have one or the other, but you can't have both. So if you have high alignment, you achieve high alignment by telling people what to do, giving people detailed instructions, and therefore that you have no autonomy. Or you can have high autonomy by letting people do what they like, letting people kind of figure things out for themselves, but then you have no alignment and you probably have chaos. So von Moltke's insight, which is key, is that these things are not on the same scale. They're separate axes almost. So we have high alignment, not by telling people what to do, by giving people clear intent of what we would like them to achieve. And then we allow them to take their own action, which give them autonomy in figuring out how do they meet that intent. So leadership for me is about setting intent, really having a good clarity of intent so that we can get alignment. And one of the ways I do that then is this model that I call TASTE. So we have True North, we have Aspirations, we have Strategy, we have Tactics, and we have Evidence. True North, the direction we want to go in. Aspirations, what results would we like to achieve? Strategy, and the guiding policies that we're going to use to get there. Tactics, the detailed work we're going to do, the coherent action. And then the evidence, how do we know whether we're doing the right thing or not? And I found these 5 elements fit together quite nicely in overall clarifying intent. So usually one of the things when we get into this model is it generates some conversation about what's a strategy and what's a tactic. And also similarly, what's the difference between aspiration and evidence? So kind of cover that one off quickly. And Russell Ackoff, in his book Differences That Make a Difference, gives some kind of really simple guidance on this, which I find very useful. So he talks about in terms of the scope, the time aspect, the magnitude, and the sort of outcomes. So strategies are global, whereas tactics tend to be more local. So strategies at the organization level, tactics at the team or the department level. Strategies are long term, so strategies are you're more looking at a 1 year or a 5 year timeline. Tactics you're probably looking at, in terms of weeks or months or quarters maybe. Magnitude, strategies much larger, tactics much smaller things. And then strategies in terms of outcomes are more about effectiveness, and Russell Adcock defines this as doing the right thing, whereas tactics are then focusing more on efficiency, which is more about doing the thing right. So again, that more local process, having the right process such that we can have high effectiveness. What's interesting when you start looking at these definitions is that they're fractal. So as you move up and down an organization, a tactic at one level is effectively strategic for the level below it. So whether something is a strategy or a tactic is very much contextual as to where in an organization you're talking. So we can apply the same sort of model for the aspirations and evidence. So aspirations tend to be more global, organizational, so more economic. Evidence tends to be more local about the things we're doing in our teams and departments. Aspirations more longer term, so they tend to be more lagging indicators. We know whether we've met the aspirations when it's the end of the year, not necessarily before. Whereas evidence are more leading indicators, so they should give us an indication in advance about whether things are working. Aspirations much larger, evidence much smaller. And again, aspirations more about the effectiveness of the organization, evidence more about the efficiency and the way we're working within our teams and departments. So we can put those 5 things in the taste model together, and they fit together quite nicely. So we start off with our true north. So the orientation, how do we decide what we should be doing? Ultimately, we want to do things that take us towards our true north. Then we have our aspirations. So if we meet our true north, if we are moving towards our true north, we should be able to achieve certain results. So those are our aspirational results. Not necessarily targets, they might be stretch goals, but they're certainly aspirational. In order to achieve those aspirations, we need some strategies in place, and those strategies are probably informed by a diagnosis of what is it we need to focus on, what are the key things we should be working on, which is stopping us meeting our aspirations. So those are our strategies. They guide the choices we make about what we're going to do, but they're not detailed choices. I sometimes describe strategies of it's a choice about how we make choices. Then we implement our strategies with tactics. So this is the coherent action we're going to take. And if our tactics are the right tactics, and if our tactics are successful, they should generate evidence, which are outcomes that are going to indicate our progress. They're evidence that indicate whether we're winning or not. And if we are, then hopefully it's evidence that we are likely and able to meet our aspirations. So we can connect these 5 things with true north at the center. And when I actually work through these models, I do it in a slightly different order. So we have true north sitting over the top. Then we start with aspirations. So what results do we want to achieve as an organization? As I said, they're lagging. They tend to be more about the economics of the organization, sales, customers, market driven, product driven, those sorts of things. They're enabled by strategies. So strategies constrain us. So they start focusing in, but they're enabling constraints. They don't tell us what to do. They enable us to make decisions. Then instead of jumping up to tactics, we can then jump over, because ultimately our strategies will lead to evidence of success. So the outcomes we're generating, they're leading indicators. They usually be more about capabilities than economics. So how good are we doing at certain process elements, or how good is our customer satisfaction, for example. And then we hopefully achieve our aspirations. Having understood our strategies and evidence, we can then start making decisions and having conversations about what do we do that's in line with our strategy, which will help us meet our evidence. So rather than jumping straight into tactics, we go through a process and go through a journey of thinking about what is it we should be focusing on, what are we trying to achieve, what outcomes are we trying to achieve, and then we can think about what tactics implement our strategies, and what tactics do we think we could do which will generate the evidence. So tactics, the activities we're going to do, experiments we're going to run, investments we're going to make. Sometimes it's, projects and programs we're going to implement. And then hopefully our tactical work will lead us to meet our aspirations. And all of these things need to be coherent with each other. So once we have all these things, we need to say, well, do all these things fit together nicely? Do they make sense? So it's not a nice and neat, where we take an aspiration and we say, well, what's the strategy for this aspiration and what's the tactic for this strategy? It's usually a many-to-many relationship, and we want to have strong coherence between all the different elements. There should be some level of correlation, but it's not necessary that a tactic is directly causing a strategy or a strategy is directly causing an aspiration. There's some level of correlation, though, and some level of contribution. So this is where the X matrix comes in, because the X matrix is it's an A3 form, so a single large sheet of paper, which allows us to visualize the model and visualize the correlations between the various things. So it looks something like this. So we start off with our aspirations, and we say we want to increase our sales by X%, for example, by the end of the year. In order to do that, we think one of our strategies is to release more frequently. I think if we have more frequent releases, we should be able to increase our sales. And we can have a conversation which says, is that coherent? Is there a correlation there? So this dot here is suggesting that there is a strong correlation between the frequency of releases and increasing sales. And then similarly, we can say, well, what evidence would we look for that suggests that we're more likely to release to meet our aspirations? And what's the correlation there? So here we're saying we think evidence of more frequent releases will be lower lead time. And here this kind of empty dot rather than a solid dot is saying, well, I don't think that's a strong correlation, but there's some correlation. It's kind of indirect, it's slightly weaker. And then we can say, well, what do we do to release more frequently and reduce our lead time? Well, let's have a tactic which is putting a continuous delivery pipeline in. And I think there's a strong correlation there. And then we fill out the X matrix, and we can have more strategies, because quite often we have multiple strategies. We don't want too many. And equally, we want multiple pieces of evidence, and we're potentially going to implement multiple tactics. And we fill in the various dots in the corners and see, does this make sense overall? Is this a coherent approach to our transformation, our improvement? And it sometimes starts showing us where the gaps and the weaknesses are. So in this example here, tactic 2, we can see doesn't really have much correlation to the strategies. It's only got a weak correlation to a third strategy. And it's only got a strong contribution to one of our exhibits and none of the others. So we could have a conversation around, is this the right tactic? Do we understand what we mean by this tactic? Maybe the strategies are wrong. Maybe we're missing some evidence. There's not that there's a right or wrong answer, but we're visualizing this on a page so that we can have a conversation about it, see where we agree, where we disagree, where we have some misunderstanding. But once we've got one of these that everybody's generally got consensus on and has developed and co-created, we now have a good, strong visualization of our intent. Ultimately, our intent is to meet the aspirations, but we also have an intent to implement some strategies. We have some intent to generate some evidence and some intent to start working on some tactics. And we can see how all those things fit together. So I have a fuller version, a kind of slightly more comprehensive version of that template, which is downloadable. The URL's on the template, and I have the URL at the end of the slide deck as well, which is Creative Commons, free to download, which you can start using to start understanding what's our strategic intent, why are we working on certain things, how do we know whether things are working, and how do we know whether we're doing the right things or not. So that's kind of leadership, is about clarifying intent. And as I said, it's about the conversation. So if anybody's read Jeff Patton's book on user story mapping, he makes a great analogy about holiday photographs. So this is a holiday photograph of my daughter about 3 years ago. It's a terrible photograph. I'm quite happy to admit that. It's out of focus, it's blurry. But I really like it as a photograph because I was there. I know what's going on. I know where we were, what we were doing, the sorts of, the sort of fun, what those bubbles actually are. So it's got meaningful for me. So it's the same with the X matrix and, A3s in general. So there's a great quote from a book by Thomas L. Jackson, where he says it's the memory of what was said and felt that creates alignment, not the final piece of paper. So when we're trying to create alignment around intent, it's not just about filling in an X matrix, but it's about co-creating and collaborating with people to populate the X matrix and generate the content for it. We end up with a great artifact that's easy to socialize and easy to look at and easy to visualize, but it's really the conversation that's important. So once we have an understanding of intent, we need to then start developing some wider understanding around the wider organization about how do we do this? Do we have the skills? Do we have the capabilities to do this? So this is where something called catchball comes in. And I define catchball as a consensus process to translate organizational strategy into the daily tactical work. So the tactics that we have on something like an X matrix, they're still kind of quite high level investments. We still need to figure out what do people do, or people need to figure out for themselves. What do we do on a daily basis, which is going to work towards implementing our strategies, generating the evidence we hope for, and ultimately meeting our aspirations. And we want, rather than dictating and telling people what to do and imposing things on people, we want to give people the freedom to come up with some of themselves and come up with ideas and suggestions. So catchball it's a metaphor literally for throwing a ball around. So it's a cooperative game, everybody participates, everybody has a chance to catch the ball and throw the ball, decide where they throw the ball. So we kind of go through this catch, reflect, improve, pass cycle where we catch the ball, or we catch an idea or a proposal or a suggestion. We reflect on it. Does it seem like a good one? Where might we agree with it or disagree with it? And then we can make some suggestions on how we might improve it, what we might do differently. And then we pass it on. We either pass it back or we pass it to somebody else that we think would be a good person to also reflect on and improve on it. So it's the idea of passing ideas around the organization so that people can reflect and improve on them. And I like the metaphor of comedy improv. So this is some ideas from a guy called Neil Malarkey, who is a kind of well-known, certainly well-known in the UK stand-up comedy improv guy. He founded the Comedy Store in London, and he now goes about teaching improv to businesses. He did a great keynote at Agile Cymru in Wales a couple of years ago. He has this LAGA acronym. So he says, good improv is listening actively for offers, accepting offers, giving offers in return, exploring assumptions, and reincorporating previous offers. So always listening for ideas. What ideas do people have? And we always accept them. We don't reject them. So the idea of yes and, not no but. We should always give offers back. Always let's contribute our own ideas and explore the assumption between other people's ideas, our ideas, and that's how we start improving things. And then as we learn, we reincorporate other, previous ideas, so that we come up with ideas, we come up with suggestions, we come up with ways of working that everybody has had the opportunity to contribute to. We don't assume that one person has the answer. The answer comes from a combination of everybody working on it. So that's really what we're trying to do with Catchball. So we probably start with some ideas in a maybe central group, and then we go off and take those ideas, and people in that group take those ideas to another group of people and play Catchball with them. And then some of those people might go off and take some of those ideas and play Catchball with another group of ideas. And those ideas then get passed around the organization, up and down the organization, kind of in and out, and hopefully getting as many people involved in it as possible. So it's not one direction, top down, kind of dictating, imposing, inflicting kind of solutions on people. We're allowing people to be involved in coming up with solutions. And usually we want the people that are closest to the problem to be the people that have the best ideas, the best knowledge to solve the problems. There's another great model that ties in with this from David Marquet in his book, Turn the Ship Around. So David Marquet, commander of a nuclear submarine, when he took over it, he was one of the worst, if not the worst performing submarine in the fleet. By the time he'd left, it was the best performing. So that's what he means by turn the ship around. And what's interesting, he got put on the submarine, and it wasn't a submarine he was familiar with. So his challenge was, how do I command this submarine when I can't give commands because I don't know what commands to give? So he developed what he calls the leader-leader model. So his bridge there is gives control. His idea was, well, rather than me controlling everybody, I want to give control to the crew so that they can make decisions themselves. And in order to do that, I need to give them clarity of my intent. We collectively need to have clarity of intent. So those are some of the things we talked around with the X Matrix. But also we need to develop competence. So we need to make sure that people have the right skills and understanding and knowledge in order to make the decisions that I'm allowing them to make. So part of developing Catchball and getting people to introduce ideas, I think, is also it's the opportunity to increase people's competence and ability and develop our people. So we can combine the Stephen Bungay model of autonomy and alignment with David Marquet's model and add a third axis. So if you think of these, this is a three-dimensional model where we have autonomy, alignment, and ability. Autonomy, giving people autonomy, is giving people control. So that's Marquet's kind of bridge. And therefore, we need to have clarity. We need to give people have strong alignment. And we need to increase people's competence. And we can say we need to develop people's ability. And therefore, we want to take people on a journey almost where as we develop people's ability and create stronger alignment, we can start giving more control. So Catchball and the idea of getting people involved is a way of doing that. Again, Bungay has more ideas around this. He talks about, this is a model he calls directed opportunism. He says we want to achieve outcomes. In order to achieve those outcomes, we make plans. We put those plans into action, and those actions will generate those outcomes. But life's not so simple. So there are gaps between these three things. The knowledge gap, the difference between what we would like to know and what we actually know. So when we're making plans, we don't know everything. So we can't necessarily make the best plans. The alignment gap, the difference between what people do, we want people to do and what they actually do. Again, we can give people plans, but what they actually do is not necessarily what we intended in the plan. And then the effects gap, the difference between what we expect our actions to achieve and what they actually achieve. So when we put the plans into action, they don't necessarily generate the right outcomes. So Bungay describes two different ways of dealing with these gaps. The first way, the more common way, is basically go for more detail. So more detailed information with more detailed plans. Those detailed plans having more detailed instructions for people, and then to make sure that people carry out the plans, we have more detailed controls in place and lots of micromanagement. So I expect most people are familiar with that sort of approach. Bungay says we need to take the opposite effect. So rather than having more detail, we have less detail. So in the knowledge gap, we limit direction to defining and communicating the intent. So just give people the intent so that people can make their own plans with what they know. Then the alignment gap is allowing people to make their plans and having the ability to back brief. So we don't just want to allow people to make plans because they might not have understood the intent. So back briefing is a way of allowing us to make sure, check that people have understood the intent that we wanted them to. And then the effects gap, kind of giving people the freedom to adjust their actions in line with the intent. So as they put their plans into action, allow people to adjust plans themselves rather than micromanaging. The interesting bit here that is relevant to Catchball is really the idea of back briefing down at the bottom. So part of Catchball is, as well as allowing people to come up with their solutions and reflect and improve on things, is replaying those back. So we give people a brief and we want them to brief their plans back to us. That's why we call it back briefing, so that we can then reflect and improve it back. Did they understand the intent to advance? There we go. So I use another A3 for this, which I call a back briefing A3, which is another, again, simple piece of paper that we want people to collaborate on. Again, it's more about the conversation than the content, but get people to make sure they understand the challenge or opportunity, the context of what we're asking them to do, be clear about what their goals are, and also so their intent, but also what's the higher intent. Do people understand how the things we're asking them to do are going to enable and help the business? We can get people to make sure do we have the right people and skills on the team? Do people understand the boundaries of their work? So we're giving people freedom. Let's make sure people understand the freedom that they have, but probably we're not giving people complete freedom. So there will be some constraints in place around the amount of money people can spend, or are people able to go off and kind of implement new technologies, for example. So understanding of freedoms and constraints, and then what are they actually going to do? What are the kind of the big things, their big plans, which are really what hypotheses are they going to start testing? And that leads us into learning. So they're going to start implementing these plans, and we want to allow people to befriend failure. We want to be treating these things as experiments. So another interactive section. So a little exercise here. So I have a rule that some sequences of numbers obey and some do not. And I'm going to ask you to try and discover what the rule is. So your clue, the information that I'm going to give you is that the sequence of numbers 2, 4, 8 obeys the rule. So I'm going to bring up another poll in a minute, and I want you to think about what new sequences of numbers would you use, so a new different sequence of 3 numbers that you will use to test your hypothesis. So you're going to look at the numbers 2, 4, 8, come up with a hypothesis of what you think the rule is, and you're going to suggest another sequence of 3 numbers which you're going to use to test the hypothesis. So put 3 numbers into the poll. If you see somebody else's 3 numbers that you think is a good set to test, you can vote it up, or if you want to put your own 3 numbers in. And again, if anybody's joined from the very beginning, this poll is on the URL pollev.com/bizagility. You can go to that on most modern mobile phones, or tablets, or just in your browser. So I'll just get a few suggestions to come up, and then I shall let you know which of these sequences pass the rule or conform to the rule, and which ones don't. So 10, 20, 40 does conform to the rule, and 1, 2, 4 also conforms to the rule. So does anybody else want to suggest a sequence of 3 numbers? 3, 9, 27 also conforms to the rule. I'll maybe just give it another minute, see if any more suggestions, and then I'll give you an opportunity, given the information you have from these tests, I'll give you the opportunity to propose what you think the rule is. Okay, let's move on to that now then. So, what do you think? What's your hypothesis about the rule? So who wants to tell me what the hypothesis is, and then I shall let you know who got it right and what the rule is. Anybody going to be brave enough? Okay, the first one, they get bigger, and the second one, multiply each subsequent number. The first answer, they get bigger, is the correct answer, actually. So yeah, normally people don't get this. Normally people go with doubling the number or some kind of multiplication rule. If I quickly go back to the suggestions that people had, what it looks like and what normally happens is that people come up with a hypothesis, and then to test their hypothesis, they propose a test which confirms the hypothesis. So I would have thought that whoever put in 10, 20, 40 had the hypothesis was that the number doubles. So 10 doubles to 20, 20 doubles to to 40. And similarly, 1 doubles to 2, 2 doubles to 4. What's happening when we do that is we're not really generating any new information, because all you're doing is confirming your hypothesis that the number doubles, and because the rule is as simple as the numbers increasing in magnitude, those tests will never fail. So you're just kind of reinforcing the idea that you're correct. So what we actually need to do when we run experiments, and part of the shift to an experimental way of thinking, is recognizing that we need to intentionally try and fail sometimes, which is extremely counterintuitive. So this is information theory, where we have the probability of failure and the information we generate. So down at this end, if we never fail, we're generating new information. So we can keep on proposing tests where the number doubles, and I will say, yes, that passes. You're not really learning anything. You're not getting any new information. Equally, if we're descent scale, if we're failing all the time, so if we're constantly proposing hypotheses, let's say, we said 3, 2, 1, which would fail, or 0, 0, 0, or -2, -4, -8. Again, once the first one fails, we're not really getting any new information. So really, the sweet spot is up here when you're failing around about 50% of the time. Now, this is contextual. This is when we want to generate new information. I quite often say that when I travel a lot and I get on an airplane, I don't want the airplane to generate new information. I don't want the airplane to crash. So actually, I would like my airplane to have a 0% probability of failure. But usually when we're doing knowledge discovery and when we're going through complex transformations, we actually do want to learn what's going to work and what's not going to work. So we need to run experiments where maybe we're intentionally failing. So that brings us to the third A3, which is an experiment A3. So again, we want people to understand the context of why we're running the experiment, what's the problem, what's the hypothesis, and what's the rationale, why are we proposing that hypothesis? And then what action we're going to take, and we want to be thinking sometimes not just to prove our hypothesis, but what action might we take to intentionally disprove our hypothesis. And then when we're looking at results, as well as just thinking about how will we detect success, how will we know whether we're successful, just to avoid that confirmation bias, we need to think about, well, what things will we look for if actually we're wrong? So let's be cognizant, let's pay attention and recognize the fact that we might be wrong and think about what failure will look like. And similarly, if we're successful, how are we going to follow this up? And if the experiment fails, also, how are we going to follow this up? So do we need to roll things back? Do we need to kind of communicate anything? Because we want these experiments to be kind of small, safe to fail experiments. So we don't want to invest, billions of dollars or euros or pounds. We don't want to put people's lives at risk. So we don't want people to put people's livelihoods and their jobs at risk. So small, safe to fail experiments, recognizing and making sure we thought through what will failure look like. And actually, maybe we want to try and fail, because if we try and fail and we succeed, we've just learnt something. Or if we thought about failure and we try and do something which we think will be success and we get failure again, that's learning, that's a good thing. So that's why we want to be befriending failure. So we're really running PDSA cycles: plan, do, study, adjust. So the Deming cycle, or the Shewhart cycle. But actually, we can think of the X matrix. If we go back to the beginning, that's a big hypothesis. The aspirations and our strategies, that's a big guess, is what we think we want to do. So as we move down through back briefing and down to experiments, we're running nested experiments. We're looking at smaller, detailed way of learning, and then once we get down to the detailed experiments, what we learn from those experiments feed back to our kind of tactics and feed back up to our X matrix. So we have the X matrix there, we do something around back briefing, and then we start running some more detailed experiments. And we take the learning and we feed it all back to the X matrix. So even the X matrix, we should be recognizing maybe our strategy is wrong, maybe our outcomes are wrong, or maybe our tactics are wrong and we're not generating the evidence we thought we would. Similarly, kind of returning to this diagram, Usually we start off with the X matrix in the middle, and then as people go off and bring more people into the organization, it's through things like back briefing and then running experiments. And that's how we communicate when we get people involved. And ultimately we have the people closest to the problem coming up with those detailed experiments, small experiments, and coming up with the solutions because they have the best information. Final kind of visualization on this. Really what we're talking about is a transformation, whether it's an agile transformation or any other form of agile of organizational transformation. So we have a leadership team that's defining true north and aspirations, which we think will lead to outcomes. And in order to deliver those outcomes, we need strategy and investments. And we probably have some operational teams that are looking at this. We're making plans and implementing tactics and evidence, and that's done by some implementation teams here. That leads to our action, and then hopefully our action leads us towards our true north and aspirations. So various kind of different pieces of the various models, I'm trying to fit them onto a single model. And also you'll notice these arrows around the outside. This isn't a cycle. These things work in both directions. So all the teams, all the levels and pieces of the organization working together to achieve our transformation. Again, A3s, back briefing, and then the experiment A3s kind of fit into this as well. So just kind of last few slides. So leading lasting learning, some questions to think about. Do you know the intent of your transformation? Are you confident that your people are able to carry it out in the long term? So long-term thinking, are you developing your people? And do your people have the freedom to fail, or are they able to run experiments in order to learn? Final poll then, just to give you a chance to maybe think about the first question. So how would you describe the intent of your transformation? So again, the same URL, pollev.com/business agility. This is going to generate a word cloud, so that's kind of the emphasis on one word. If you do want to put 2 words, I think you need to hyphenate them or camel case them. Let's see what you think, how you would describe the intent of your transformations. So customer satisfaction, learning, flow. So hopefully if you go and talk to people in your organizations, if you've got kind of real clarity of intent, they would be talking about the same things. This is why we're doing an agile transformation. You know, the focus is on customer satisfaction or learning or predictability or flow, etc. And the A3s that I've talked about, these are ways that I like to create that intent, clarity of intent, alignment, and allow people to be involved into figuring out how do we do this. Quick slide, so on the books that I've referenced, so these are the kind of my main influences in developing some of this material and some of these ideas. The top URL there is where you can download the templates from. They're all Creative Commons, feel free to use them. The middle URL is a kind of page from my blog, which just pulls together various posts on a lot of these ideas in one place. And then probably not so relevant for this audience, if I think most of you are probably in the US, but if anybody are in the UK or want an excuse to visit the UK, I'm running a masterclass. I meant to put the date on this slide actually, so it's the middle of October, the 9th, 10th, 11th of October, 3-day masterclass with Mike Burrows. If you know Mike, he's doing a lot of work with his agenda shift approach. And that, I kind of think there's very strong alignment. So we're kind of brainstorming and co-creating a 3-day masterclass just to see what we can learn about agenda shift and this X matrix strategy deployment approach. So I think I've kept a little bit better time than I did earlier, and we have time for questions.
So everybody should be free to come off of mute and ask questions, and then we'll do a quick wrap up about 3 till. So we have about 5 minutes for questions. And Brian, welcome. You guys are more than welcome to come off mute.
So I either explained it perfectly or I've just confused everybody. Probably the latter.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, hey Karl, Greg Cohen here, and thank you so much for the presentation. It was really fantastic and thoughtful. So the one of my biggest challenges, and it goes back to David Marquette's work, is assessing competence. And to me, it's sort of this third axis. You have alignment.
Yeah.
That creates the ability for autonomy, but I've seen a lot of teams where it doesn't work, and I'm mostly on the product management side, because there's not competence in a certain knowledge area or a skill set. And often sort of what I see is there's not competence with truly understanding the customer or the market space or the competitive environment. How do you address that?
So that's one of the ways I use A3s, and actually it kind of goes back to the way A3s were used by Toyota originally, and their problem A3, which was really about kind of mentoring people. So I think the story goes that your first day at Toyota, you turn up at your desk and you have a blank A3, and your manager, who effectively is your mentor, gives you a problem to solve, and you go off and you populate the A3 with how you would solve that problem and come back to your manager, and your manager will give you feedback on that. So that's another way of using it, is by getting people to populate these things, you get an understanding as a manager or a leader about how are people approaching these things, and maybe where do they need some additional guidance or additional training in order to improve their competence, so that you have more confidence in giving more control to them. And therefore, you can work with them to improve A3s as part of that as well.
All right, thank you.
Great. Other questions?
Well, if anybody thinks of anything, ping me on Twitter or email me, or I'm on the Slack group now. So if something, you wake up in the middle of the night thinking about something, I might not respond in the middle of the night, but feel free to ping me, via various channels, and I'm quite happy to talk about this stuff.
All right, well, everybody, let's do a quick wrap up. And so, Karl, if you don't mind, I'll take the screen back.
Sure.
And let me go back here. Just a refresher that our upcoming monthly schedule is September 6th. We're trying the time of 12:30 and 3 o'clock, 12:30 Indian time and 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Seems to hit the most time zones. So Manoj Khanna, as I said, we'll be talking next month. And I'd love to get other people's submissions for November, and more than happy to bump myself for October as well. And if you need an invite, then message me, either email me at jeremy@pelotas.com or at Twitter @JeremyPullen, and be more than delighted to give you an invite to the Slack channel and to add you to the invite list for future sessions. We'll send a calendar invite so that it's on your calendar and blocked, and you don't have to go and find the posts on LinkedIn or Twitter to know to sign up. So with that, thanks again, Karl. Fantastic presentation. We'll post this on YouTube once we've processed it. and really look forward to future talks and content that you have to share with us.
Great, thank you. And I should meant to mention, I'll put the slides onto the Slack channel and share them with you. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody, and hope
Thanks,
you have
everyone.
a great day.